Great. Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, I should say. We are here for our second lunch and learn on a work stream we've been working on in the county over the spring, summer, and now into the fall, looking at transforming Arlington's office inventory, particularly focusing on regulatory approaches to allow buildings to repurpose themselves, with a particular focus, as we'll talk about later, on a first phase of adaptive reuse regulations. So just some logistics. Today's webinar is being recorded. We have with me Jill Hunger from CPH, the Community Planning and Housing Development Department. And she will be moderating questions as well as answering questions related to some of the regulatory elements as well. We have Jane Kim with Arlington Economic Development, who will be helping to collect the questions, and Jennifer, who you heard from, who's looking at the back end on tech support. So if you have any problems with that, put that in the Q&A as well. The team behind the scenes may be looking at the questions in bunches. So if you don't get exactly your question asked, it maybe have rolled into others, but please be persistent. If you have some questions you don't think has been answered, the questions will be recorded and posted alongside the presentation and the in the video after this meeting. So everything will be publicly posted. All right, so the agenda. So we're going to start with a quick look at process and then some of the justification, and then move into the meat of the presentation, which is the guidance, the zoning ordinance amendments, and talk about some administrative guidance and regulations, and then get back into timeline and questions. So we hope to be doing this in about 20-25 minutes. So we can have plenty of time for Q&A. So what are the elements of this process change of looking to transform Arlington's office building inventory? Really three major components. One is a county board policy, which we'll talk about and introduced in the last lunch and learned. Second is a series of zoning ordinance amendments that we'll discuss in detail. And then third, which does not require county board approval, but we are still looking to get done this year, certainly by the end of the year, is the administrative regulations and or guidelines that include important components like submittal checklists and what you need to submit to apply for this new process. What are the elements of process and timing, and then what are the standards and conditions through which we'll view a amendment proposal. I won't go into too much depth because if you want more information, we've had plenty of presentations over the summer and fall, including the last lunch and learn that looked at why we're doing this and the state of the market. But just as a quick refresher, clearly the office market weaknesses do have a definitive harmful impact on Arlington's tax revenue base and overall quality of life, and that those challenges of the market are structural in both supply and demand, that they include a component of obsolete office supply. I'm not sharing my PowerPoint.
No, you're not sharing the PowerPoint.
Okay. Go back. Sorry about that. This is why Jennifer's in the back end. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, and now it's fine?
Perfect. Thank you, Mark.
Great, thank you. Sorry about that. And so when we look at the impact of the office market, and the challenge of the office market, including obsolete office supply, as I was just mentioning, which is obviously relative to overall market trends, but is obviously a consistent measure of just an aging office inventory in general. And then we're seeing some micro and macro level trends related to declining office values and assessments, what that does to tax revenues, and what the idea of distressed or vacant assets does to impacts on place and placemaking. And certainly we think while we are trying to be proactive and aggressive and bold in addressing some of these challenges, the worst may be yet to come, particularly on the tax revenue side, as assessments continue to decline but lag getting to our tax rolls. So what are some of the barriers that we think are justify the policy? One is that change in use in and of itself today in the zoning ordinance requires a major site plan amendment that doesn't reflect maybe the complexity or different types of complexity of projects that may come forward relative to change in use. We have broader land use plans like a sector plans or small area plans that often look at use as a major guidance in how those policies should be implemented from a 4.1 site plan process. And while they were obviously visionary for their time and a long-term vision, some of them may have not be reflective of the current challenges we're facing in our economic and commercial markets. And then finally, the bulk of the work is that each site plan is its own essentially zoning ordinance with a number of site plan conditions that limit flexibility, that weave together, and that when you try to update a sector plan, say for use or for some slight improvements, you're often running into a full wholesale look at the site plan. And so we're trying to streamline that process relative to understanding how to amend the site plan and reflect amendments to all the conditions as appropriate. So from a policy standpoint, again, the overarching policy statement that we look for a bold intervention into the policy and regulatory structure, that we're looking at the impacts on economic, fiscal, and placemaking as an important justification. And that justification establishes the repurposing or transformation of obsolete office buildings as a public priority. We'll get to in a little bit why that's even more important from a regulatory structure, but it really establishes this from a policy standpoint as a main primary priority or goal of the county to address this issue. And again, with the focus on this existing obsolete office buildings, we are certainly not saying that the office market won't continue to grow in certain areas or be dynamic with new construction, with repositioning. We support all those as functions of a very healthy overall office market, but the obsolete office drag is something we are trying to address. So a lot of this will reference, you'll see on the left or on the right and certain slides, these sort of references to language that are in the current version, the October 1st version of the policy. We are continuing to update that, and we'll have a new version out probably the next week or so. And then up to board consideration in November. But the first part of the policy that deals with after the justification is, well, what are we looking at in terms of writ large obsolete office buildings, and how do we look to address that issue? And across the spectrum of a variety of different options that maybe an owner would have, from adaptive reuse or what's often called conversions, or repositioning of the building, such as investments into an office building to make it more competitive, or some form of redevelopment, that they all share a common thread of needing to shorten review time and limit upfront costs in order to let the market accelerate that element of change. So looking at how we look at new, clearer processes. Some will obviously look at, we'll start with looking at our existing processes as always, but in the case of adaptive reuse, as we'll discuss, the distinction was made that a new process was needed to be very clear and structured around how that process will look different. And that's something a lesson learned that we may apply to different other changes over the next year or so. Looking at what submittal requirements are, one of the things we've heard loud and clear from the development community is the challenges of entitlement and financing as time, but also just the mere cost of the amount of information that has to be provided and the cost of preparing that information. And while we are not saying we're going to skip steps in the process or not receive information that's critical to review, some of these reuse projects really are changing very little relative to the existing site, and we should then be requiring information that is appropriate of that context. So that pared down checklist leads to a focused draft review, and we think continued discussion of more concise engagement, not less thorough, but more concise. And then how we look at site plan standards, both in terms of development standards, site standards, relationship to county's goals and policies, as well as standard site plan conditions, and how those are reflected as a applicant comes to reopen an existing site plan, And then how do we deal with modifications, particularly with regard to density? We'll get into that in a second. So adaptive reuse, once again, is really just the change in primary use from office to other use. For this round of regulatory change, we are looking at just office buildings, converting as a principal use, converting to an alternative use. Primarily, these will involve projects where interior fit out and conversion is the significant part of the construction process, which has an impact both on the timeliness in a positive way, and obviously from a review standpoint is less complicated than maybe full building redesign. There will be exceptions that we'll talk about in particular with the review, but also within potentially density adds such as ground floor repositioning, rooftops, terraces, and balconies, mezzanines, facade refreshments, landscaping refresh, and outdoor amenities, and then unrequired parking translating into GFA, knowing that a lot of times the alternative use requires less parking under policy and ordinance than does maybe the older previously approved office site plan. All of these are within the context of us wanting to give the development community the opportunity to repurpose office buildings, but to also make improvements that benefit the project, but also the public realm and the overall neighborhood, so that projects are not just about changing a use and flipping a switch, as it is never going to be anyways, but that this is an opportunity for a developer to think differently about how the building faces a street, faces a public space, faces its look and feel. So and its functionality. So all those things are important that we provide the greatest level of flexibility for those great ideas to come forward and not be hung up in process. One thing that we have sort of laid a marker in the ground is this will not be a process for altering previously committed to community benefits, major community benefits like a park or open space or transportation improvement or civic facility. Those sort of things which have already been provided. This will not be an opportunity to say reduce the size of an existing park that was part of a community benefit. That will have its own process if that's something that's required of the application. But in this case, we want to make sure that we're not providing lack of clarity to the community about what the level of change may be associated with some of these projects, which we think are still relatively minimal. What does a streamlined process look like? When we look at we started with a whole bunch of different ways to look at it, but we are not amending minor or major definitions in the Arlington Code and zoning ordinance. Rather, we are setting up a new process in the zoning ordinance that is clearly focused on this one activity, which is amendments to office buildings for change in use and for improvements to the building. We do look to get to a timing, which is 120 to 150 days is sort of what we're thinking about now. The point is that a major site plan amendment may take 8 months, 9 months, 12 months. Who knows? It's less clear. We are looking to at least cut that significantly in half or more, and to really think about this as a more streamlined, clear process for the applicant and for its investors. The method of review and approval, we did look at administrative pathways for a significant amount of time, found that they were not necessarily viable or sufficient. So this will still end up with a county board consideration and approval ultimately. But that the process itself will be streamlined. So that difference between administrative versus legislative will not really, we think, will be a time factor. In fact, we often think that sometimes having a clear legislative path sometimes makes it clearer from a timeline standpoint, giving the notice of public hearings and things like that. So it will provide the context for appropriate submittal requirements, staff review, site plan standards, as I said, and then potential changes to the engagement approach. So we've had discussed a number of meetings with our planning commission, subcommittees, and an active discussion is what is the role of the planning commission and other commissions in review. We have had some good, robust conversations about that and about the need, shared desire to be flexible. We're just working through sort of what that may look like. But once again, with the idea of streamlining still at the forefront while allowing public review or public knowledge of these projects. And the criteria and limitations meant to be flexible but focused, and what that means obviously is a misnomer a bit, but it's meant to say that we want to make sure that we're allowing a number of different types of projects that fit within these particular guardrails of an office building approved by a site plan that wants to change use. So that's a significant key differentiator. Each project will have its own little anomalies that we think we want to be able to maintain flexibility about serving or addressing. Again, I mentioned these are for site plan projects. As of right now, we're not including form-based code or by right. Part of that is the complexity of particularly by right. We're not doing that from a perspective of not particularly needing that. We're going to study that further down the road, but from a complexity issue, we wanted to get the site plan process done first, and then we'll look at other aspects of how buildings could change in the county going forward. And again, no major changes to community benefits. So some of those density flexibility that we talked about will provide in the zoning ordinance, as we'll discuss, sort of a mechanism for providing that flexibility. And that will be, unlike maybe some other ways in the zoning ordinance to earn density, do not come at maybe a significant cost. To put it a different way, that the process of repurposing an office building in and of itself is a community benefit and a public priority. And that will allow us to write in the zoning ordinance and ultimately be considered and perhaps approved by the board, their future ability to provide additional density and in some forms height, mostly involving rooftops, for different activities that improve the building, whether it be the density calculation change in zoning, like conversions of density, which is a technical aspect for those of you in the know or know well, which is that some zoning ordinances have an FAR designation for office and a per unit acre units per acre for residential or hotel, and that leads to sometimes some confusion about what density is actually allowed when you convert a use. But really, for the public facing aspect, the ground floor bump outs, all the things I mentioned before, this is really about building improvement. And then conversion of unused parking, we are still in discussion about, this is an exciting thing for us. I think we're all excited about the idea of taking an existing asset, which is parking, but if there's too much parking than is required or needed for the new use, that we make productive use of that, often involve turning it into gross floor area. But that may be tied to some on and off site improvements to be able to achieve that transportation demand. So that more to come on that. And then relationship to existing guidelines, such as the sector plans, affordable housing master plan, green building and parking. This policy is going to consider how the trade-offs and relationships of these policies. I can tell you the continued going theme is that for this purpose, the repurposing of obsolete office buildings is a public priority, is a county priority, and that while all these other set policies and goals are also priorities, and there's some blending there, we want to make sure we're being careful about overburdening an already relatively a new process for the county and a relatively nascent part of the real estate community investment structure about conversions, and not loading on too much sort of expectations and or requirements that make projects infeasible. And then the last part of the policy, which I think for a lot of people will be just as sort of interesting as how it progresses over the next year or so, is other future changes to regulatory framework that are teed up by the policy, from pre-construction switches, which right now we have a process now that works pretty well, but we may want to continue to amend and adapt that, to looking at office building repositioning, making that as easy as possible, working with our overall look at major, minor, and administrative change definitions in the zoning ordinance, what we call adaptive reuse plus or partial redevelopment. And this is where perhaps where a building is being maintained, the superstructure is being maintained, but stories are being added or building additions are being added, but it's significantly more density than under pure adaptive reuse. Or what we're seeing a lot of is partial redevelopments where developers are coming in, maybe keeping the underground parking, even maybe a first or second floor podium, and then building a new structure above it with a new use. And the question is, should that process look different than the last, which is the most common for the past several decades, which is the full redevelopment? And all of these will look at the same things, which is the submittal requirements, the engagement and review, how we reflect county policies and site plan standards, the method and cost for height and density. And then finally, we do reference in the policy an important, but albeit on this day, a secondary to the regulatory, but still important, looking at financial incentives and public-private partnerships as a solution, as another tool in the toolbox. So I will walk through the zoning ordinance. Jill will also be on to answer any questions after the presentation is over, or to clarify any statements I make. So Jill, please speak up. But the proposed amendment to the zoning ordinance is really about the implementation of the policy. The policy sets up the county board's expectations. The zoning ordinance is one of the tools to implement it along with administrative guidelines. As I said, the current version of the draft language establishes a new category of site plan amendments in 15.59, which is an adaptive reuse amendment that has its own criteria, findings, and standards. And because this structure is analogous to other amendment categories, you won't see a separate definition in the zoning ordinance, but that's not problematic because it's clearly laid out in the text of the zoning ordinance itself. So how do you qualify? One, if you're in a previously approved site plan, we are looking at language that may include buildings that were not previously approved by site plan, but are going through a site plan to change the building, which could potentially happen. But for the most part, this is going to be approved site plans amending an existing site plan. That we are talking about making sure that this is a clear process. And part of that is that we do not want this to create a different inventory of buildings that have a different process for the life of the building. This is really meant to be a one-time opportunity for the building to repurpose itself through a site plan amendment process that streamlines that approach. And then, if 15 years later, there's a minor site plan amendment that is needed for a particular need, that would go through the process of the time for that. But this is really meant to be sort of the big one swing in the other direction for the building. And then we have obviously a focus on office. So right now the language says 50% of the office, the principles of the building has to be office, and that more than 50% of the office use that is included would need to be converted to be eligible. We're still working with those numbers. Obviously, anytime you put a number in, you imagine a scenario where it's 49% and 49%, and we try to think about ways that we can mitigate that, and we'll continue to work on that over through November. We also have a placeholder in there. The building has been occupied for at least 5 years. This is really just a call out to a lot of different jurisdictions that have age limitations or criteria. We didn't think a particular year was any more compelling than any others when we're looking at decades, but I think there was at least a acknowledgement of a new building should at least have the ability to sort of compete as a new office building for office tenants, given once again that we do have a sensitivity to not just we would like new quality office buildings, not older, and therefore new quality buildings we want to make sure are there for tenant demand when it does exist. We do create a new section around the increased density in 15.59D that lays out how you achieve some of these modifications to the building. And then a sort of a catch-all, but important one is that all previous conditions of the approved site plan have been met. So we're working on potential snags of this, we want to make sure we're not being unintentionally cumbersome, but I think we obviously want site plans that are in good standing. You do not qualify for the adaptive reuse amendment if you have significant changes to the roof line, except for perhaps rooftop amenity space, going from excluded maybe mechanical space to a true occupiable space. That has an increased gross floor area with additions greater than 2 stories above finished grade. So again, we talked about retail and ground floor bump outs as a possibility, but we don't want full building additions. Again, that is not precluded in the county process, just we'll go through a different process. We do talk about no changes to vacations existing public, no vacation or amendments to existing public easements. We are obviously looking at one area around encroachment of balconies that we may want to resolve, but this is really meant to say, once again, that long-standing expectation of the original site plan approval is not amended through a streamlined process that needs a little more review or public comment. So we're happy to take questions and comments on that as well. That there's no changes to any of the other public priorities provided by the previous approved site plan, and any other reductions in commitments as required by county board. So again, I mentioned as a part of the policy, the idea that we're looking at a public priority. And what that does is it allows us to create this new process that has new ways of looking at both density, as I mentioned before, as well as clarifying what that activity is. One important point is that tying it to while it's a site plan amendment, tying it closer to rehabilitation or renovation than pure ground up development, which rehabilitation and renovation already hold a place in the zoning ordinance of having some relaxed standards, and trying to meet somewhere in the middle, but once again, create a new process that's clear of that distinction, and removes the applicability of affordable dwelling requirements in 1558. So since the building's not changing significantly, and there's another method for achieving density, that both base and extraordinary community benefits associated with affordable housing are not expected, although are not precluded if someone comes forward with an affordable option that brings to bear resources that make that happen. So including local. Findings. So what are the additional height and density? One is that, like most things in zoning ordinance, there is a basic checklist of how the board can create its findings that allows for its approval. One would be that the action is consistent with the change in use, meaning that the improvements to the building are consistent with that primary purpose, the change in use, that it reflects the overall reinvestment of the building, and then enhances the public realm. Obviously, that's taking broadly as the building is a much better neighbor, and has obviously some of the public elements, or at least outward-facing site elements, have had a refresh or a relook in terms of their quality and age. So again, typical types of typical height and density. We've already gone a lot of this stuff, so again, a lot of them very important, but obviously relatively minimal changes to a building. So no additional height or density of significance. The one that's probably the most has the most potential for a large number of gross floor square footage is the parking area, and we'll be looking at that. But that obviously doesn't impact as much. It doesn't impact the form of the building itself. And then finally, I mentioned the third stool, which is not something that requires county board approval, but is important to part of the conversation leading to November for two reasons. One is that it is a second way we implement the policy and implement the Arlington and the zoning ordinance changes. So without understanding how the administrative regulations and guidelines will work, kind of leaves it as an open-ended question, and we want to make sure that we have a clear path forward for the board to consider and understand what the impact on the community, both positive, which I think will be great, and any negative impacts, which I think will be limited. But that understanding is clear. So we want to get those done by the end of the year, concurrent with continued discussions this month and into next, with both publicly and with the board ultimately. And these are the common lists of submittal checklist, process and engagement, timing, site and building standards, and standard playing conditions. The second reason why we are obviously motivated to do this is that we know that this is probably the key factor in a decision by an owner and its investors on, okay, how is this really going to look at the back end? Are there any surprises with regard to costs, with regard to process? What is the level of certainty? And so this will provide that clearer path, even more so than the zoning ordinance, which provides more general authority. And finally, timeline and engagement. You'll see we've had a number of engagement touch points already, including the lunch and learn in July, the second lunch and learn now in October. Between then, presentations to the Planning Commission's Long Range Planning Committee, and just this week, the LRPC and the Zoning Committee. We've talked to the Economic Development Commission, the Housing Commission, and we'll be talking to C2E2, the Climate Change and Energy Environment Commission, along with our friends in DES on green building policy and adaptive reuse, and then Transportation Commission, and then finally into the bulk of the Planning Commission and County Board hearings. One important touch base point, which I've talked to several of you about, just looking at the list of who's on this call, but for the broader audience, we are setting up and hopefully very quickly this week we'll be, or early next, we'll be sending out dates for more focused developer practitioner forums. And this is not to exclude anyone, but to really include from a very technical standpoint, the folks that have the experience or knowledge of how these buildings will actually be converted, and therefore what standards are reasonable and which ones aren't. And so that will be a very deep dive into both the regulatory framework as well as some of the building elements that go through conversion. And we have obviously been educated, as with everyone else, as to other examples across the region and the country that have done this, as some of the challenges of conversions, but we want to make sure that our regulations are reflecting that appropriately, but also we're getting the highest quality buildings we can possibly get as a true partner with the development community. So with that said, I will now leave it for questions and discussion. And I'll kick it off to Jill, who may have some questions teed up. I don't know.
Sure. And again, just a reminder to everyone that if you have any questions, to please put it in the Q&A. Review them and post them. I think right now we have one question mark, and the question was regarding, what will the filing requirements be for an adaptive reuse amendment in terms of documents and plans?
I'm sorry, Jill, can you repeat that? I think you
Sure. What will be the filing requirements for an adaptive reuse amendment in terms of documents and plans?
Yeah. So a good question, and that falls under the administrative. I would say as of right now, we are still working through the details on that quickly to get to something that we can share publicly with the broader development community, as well as the community itself, broader community itself, on what those look like. I will say that a couple of just important concepts, and willing to talk about some details if you have some thoughts out there and can put into the Q&A. But clearly, again, this concept we are taking seriously about the submittal requirements matching what the context is for the change in the building. So this will be less than a 4.1 checklist. I can tell you that if we wouldn't be doing it if it was the same checklist as a 4.1. It'll be significantly less. It'll focus on those elements of the building design that are changing and require review. And that's not only from a land use perspective, but talking to our friends in ISD, having them have the proper plans to be able to review, get started on review. So there's a separate element of that we'll discuss about the concurrent process of meeting with our building official. So it'll be a lot less. And again, I think the key areas of interest that we'll probably see in terms of review will be floor layout, floor by floor layouts, just understanding how the new use is being accommodated, any changes to parking and parking levels. If you are changing parking from required to the use to unrequired, where is those lines and boundaries? Where's the restriping? What is the mix of parking? Is there any changing to loading and different types of loading activities that may need to be reflected? Any impacts on the site area, including the landscape area, open space? A lot of times we see in some of these conversions, the older office buildings are, let's say, a little tired in terms of their exterior presence, a lot of hardscape, a lot of sort of old furniture and fixtures and things like that. And a lot of times it's the developer that's coming forward at first and sort of saying, I'd like to refresh that and we'd like to review it. But obviously the plan's only relative to that, level of sort of landscape and design and review. So think of it more as an admin change for type process for landscape changes. And so those are the types of things that we'll be putting down on paper to sort of get to. I think the other point of that we certainly want to follow through on is as important as the initial checklist and submittal is a clear sense of that you're not going to be surprised in day 100 of a new requirement or condition or benefit that you need to provide that comes out of that you have to now accommodate within the entitlement process. So we are trying to be very clear about not only what is required to submit, but also what is the expectation of the types of things that will be asked of you, the developer or owner, to perform to ultimately get to a county board consideration. So those are the things we're focused on. I know that's more of a sort of non-answer to an answer, but we don't have the list yet, but we are working on that over the next couple of weeks to get that for review in November, so that we have something hopefully by the end of the year that you can start applying. There is a basic, and then Jill, if you want to speak to this, maybe getting too much of the weeds, but there is also a basic question of like, okay, how does it work in permanent Arlington? That's being worked on. We're working on the process of how you actually submit the electronic forms under what system.
You're going
well,
into the weeds, so I'm going to pull you out a little bit, and because
all
we
right.
have a couple more questions that are coming in.
All right, perfect.
I think part of it is just with respect to, you had a slide and spoke about owner, developer, and practitioner forums. If people are interested on this call, how best should they contact you or be pulled into those forums?
Yeah. So one, Jennifer, help me out. Do we have the emails of everyone that signed up, right, for both 1 and 2?
Correct.
Yeah. So we will include you on an email blast with a list of dates of both. I think we're going to do either in person or virtual for a number of different dates. We're not going to do hybrid, but yes, we will include you on that, and you can sign up. Essentially, we'll have limited number of participants for each time, but we're willing to schedule as many meeting times as is productive to get as much input as possible. We know there's a tremendous amount of knowledge out there already, and we're not trying to recreate the wheel here. So you'll be on that email blast of, hey, sign up for a date. It'll be, I guess, either in person here in Boston in the AED office of Arlington County, or it'll be virtual. We'll give options for both. So that's how you can get involved in that discussion. And I also mentioned one of the things the email blast will say is feel free to forward on to other people. Like, I think we have a good contact list of developers, say, but practitioners, you may say, I want to invite my architect or invite my engineer or invite my landscape designer. Those are all very welcome. The more voices, the better. The more expertise, the better.
Great, thanks, Mark. There's a question of, like, based on what you've been hearing, which of the adaptive reuse options do you anticipate will be attractive to owners of empty commercial buildings? Perhaps reduced or no parking, or increased building heights, just generally.
But yeah, I think the elements of change that we've seen and have heard most about are, I think there's a lot of interest in parking, about given that many of the buildings that we would see were approved under a parking ratio that is even much higher amount of parking than we approve for an office building today. So it's not just the change in use, it's the vintage of when it was approved. And they don't need that parking, and that there's a lot of opportunity to create interesting uses and amenity space and things like storage that are not usually penciled out in new construction. So there's that. I think facade changes, those sort of things, I think vary. I think for the most part, we definitely see folks still talking about sort of things like windows being replaced. Not as much maybe true reskinning of a building where they're taking down the entire skin of the building and rebuilding it, but more of refreshing that. And then I think a lot of work has been done by other projects. A lot of focus has been on the exterior, on the landscaped areas, on the site areas, to make them as welcoming and amenity focused as possible for residents or for visitors if it's a hospitality project. Knowing that is often different than an office use, but more importantly, that those older office buildings probably aren't the best in class even for office in terms of creating those amenities. So that's been another focus.
Great, Mark, thanks so much. I think there's a couple of questions in just around sort of the timing of this, and not necessarily this piece of it, but with, we had mentioned sort of the sweet spot of 100 to 150 days. One is just sort of recognizing that maybe other jurisdictions have a little bit of a faster review process, and also recognizing that sometimes lenders that are owners of these buildings and these assets sort of want to know within like a 30-day time frame. So I guess one is level of comfort, and two, just sort of our process.
Yeah, I think that the work that we're doing is trying to solve a couple of timing issues. One is, I think, I don't want to oversell, but I certainly don't want to undersell the importance of this regulatory reform on providing clarity for investors, right? And so there's the question of when can I get the final approvals versus is there a clear path forward? And I think today what we hear the most is an investor can't even get to the clear path forward discussion. They're looking and sort of saying, I don't know what a 4.1 is going to look like. I don't know what I'm going to be asked to provide or asked to do. It's going to change over time, and I don't know when that's going to stop. And so I think having a process that lays out a time frame becomes, to me, a critical first step. I think once you get into saying 120 versus 150, I think clearly some decisions are being made faster than that. Although I also don't think that I would love to hear of jurisdictions that are doing it faster than 100 days, because I don't know if that's, we've talked to all the jurisdictions, and I don't know if that's necessarily when some soup to nuts what is actually happening. But I think case by case, maybe. And certainly things like buy right and things like that, I think are usually can be easier. But in terms of a major site plan amendment, I know in Fairfax has done a fair amount of these that they are still in the months. So I think the point is that we want to be realistic. The idea of going through review, getting to the county board 3 months is a pretty significant speed up in terms of any other process we have for amending a site plan, other than very, very minor changes.
Great, thank you very much. And I think part of that and the timing associated with this is, it's something that has been grappled by members of our planning commission in our meetings with the LRPC, as well as the joint meeting with the long range planning committee and the zoning committee of the planning commission, is just understanding the engagement associated with this, and recognizing that the changing of full buildings use, as well as any of the exterior and everything, what does that engagement look like, especially with the community or something that you've been envisioning?
Okay. Any other questions?
Did you not hear that one?
Oh, no, I didn't. I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. It just sort of stemming along the lines of, the conversations that we've heard with some of the planning commissioners in the LRPC, the Long Range Planning Committee, as well as the zoning committee, is, sort of that engagement piece of recognizing that some of these buildings, it might be a fully new use that had been there for a while, and sort of trying to figure out how the engagement, especially with the community, occurs.
Yeah, so I think the engagement with the community, I think we're going to be a bit of a learning mode the first couple of days. I'll be honest with everyone. I think we're definitely going to go in with a view of having a more concise sort of streamlined process of review, and things like, for those of you that are in the know, things like SPRCs, which are Site Plan Review Committee of the Planning Commission, which is the kind of working group that does site plan review before it gets to the full body. We're talking about whether that process can and should change for this, whether the Planning Commission meeting itself will have a different approach. And these are all things, once again, we're talking with the Planning Commission. So we obviously work with the Planning Commission on their own process, but it is their process, and ultimately the role of the board to guide their commission on that. So we think, and then you combine things like virtual and recorded presentations, outreach to directly impacted civic associations. I think there's a lot of opportunity to get the word out there, to provide project details, to get comment, and still do it in a relatively short time frame, given that the list of things, once again, changing in a building are not all that significant relative to a ground up building, which is, you look at obviously the variety of factors associated with that building's impact. So I think what we do want to get across is that a change in use, and I think the policy really tries to continue to reinforce this, is the change in use should not be the barrier to the community review, and that we need to reflect upon a new world context that that buildings are going to be used differently. The idea of what we knew what an office building was, we knew what a residential building was, I think is slowly blurring together, or quickly, depending on how you look at it. And I think that change in use should really be about the focus on how the building actually works, not about some preconceived notion of what a right balance is or what the right use of a building is, given that a lot of uses sort of blend those. And so we like to think more in terms of activity of building than use of building. And that's why we're trying to get these regulations to start that conversation from a review standpoint.
Great, thank you so much. There was a question, and maybe if you want to bring up a slide again and talk about just sort of the affordable housing side of it, and why this wouldn't be part of that conversation.
Yes, so there's one, just as a quick, when we talk about affordable housing and site plans, there are two basic areas that we generally focus on. One is the affordable housing ordinance, or ADU ordinance, which looks at, from a formulaic standpoint, based upon steps of density, the payments and or on or offsite units that must be provided for a developer pursuing a 4.1 special exception. That's authority provided by the state and codified through our own ordinance. Many of you that are veterans of the Arlington process know that that was a long process of getting to that point where the developer still has the ability to either make a payment or provide units. And that's based upon what we typically call the base density. And that's the base zoning density. The reason why we are not applying that is because currently the ordinance says renovation, rehabilitation are not applicable. That is not, the ADU is not applicable to renovations and rehabilitation. And we would put this type of activity, the adaptive reuse, closer to renovation or rehabilitation rather than ground up new development. And so that density, quote unquote, is already sort of paid for its way with affordable housing. Even if the affordable housing didn't exist at the time, it paid what it was supposed to pay at the time of the approval. The second component is this idea of extraordinary community benefits. And that is where density is earned through our incentive-based zoning, often driven by our sector plans, that says you can earn from a 3.8 FAR to a 10 FAR if you provide any number of benefits, either outlined in the sector plan or that are broader county policies. And affordable housing is often one of those. So that's where you'll get, well, this project in Roslyn or Crystal City or Ballston is providing X number of units on site for affordable. And that was a negotiation based upon density that was earned through that section of the zoning ordinance that looks at how you earn heightened density through providing additional affordable housing. And that is a negotiation of sort of how much value that density has, for lack of a better term, and the ability of that project to absorb that and meet that affordability requirement. But in this case, we're not adding a lot of new height and density. The density that we'll be adding, and that would be met under a different part of the zoning ordinance as proposed, is really relatively minimal. And we do not think is appropriate to try to tackle something like affordable housing, which is generally looking at much more larger additions of density to a site plan proposal. So that's kind of sums it up. I don't know if that was clear or made it less clear or more clear, but Jill, if you have anything else to add, please let me know.
No, I think you covered it pretty well. In sort of how we're looking at this and how we're looking at these adaptive reuse amendments. So I think, there was a question in here, and maybe I'll just sort of field it, just like, how do we know, with the finding about it being an improvement or enhancement to the public realm. And I think you touched upon this, Mark, right? Is that for some of these buildings, likely they're older, and improvements will be made to the landscaping. There might be an opportunity to refresh the facades, but also, for some buildings that might be set back significantly from our sidewalks or have service drives or sort of a porte cochere, is an opportunity to sort of fill that space, for up to 2 stories to engage that sort of public realm as well, But if you had anything else of, that improvement and the enhancement to the public realm, that would be great. Or you didn't, I don't know.
No,
Okay, great.
no, I'm sorry. I'm also multitasking looking at the chat, but I'm sorry.
Yes. That's my job, so don't worry about it. We're handling it. And I think, we've answered many of these questions already. I think I think you mentioned it at the beginning, but to clarify that we will be posting this recording, the transcript, the Q&As that we received, and the presentation itself online. Likely either later today or by tomorrow. The idea is that you can find all of this information if you go to the main Arlington County website, arlingtonva.us, and in the search you can type in Commercial Market Resiliency Initiative, and it should bring you to the main page. So I just wanted to make certain that everybody was aware of that. At this point, I don't think that we have any other questions. I think we've been able to answer them all. Oh, sorry, one more has come in. So I guess the question, and Mark, you might have mentioned this early on, it's been, of interest to many people about the conversions of taking office buildings into residential. And I think we've all heard about the challenge. So in looking at Arlington, what percentage of the buildings or what number of the buildings do you think might be able to be converted?
Yes, that's a great question, and one we get all the time. And I'll put on my crystal ball a little bit on this one, because I think anyone's guess is as good as mine, or better. But we definitely think of the 326 office buildings in Arlington, and that includes all office buildings approved by any number of things by right or site plan. That probably a dozen, maybe, when we looked at some of the basic criteria, such as floor plates and ceiling heights and age of building and vacancy and at-risk vacancy and all those other factors that may lead to someone making a decision to empty the building and convert it or to reuse it. Then about a dozen. And we think that we've got probably several of those that are actively waiting for this process to be completed so they can apply and get something in by next year. And so we think over the next 12 to 18 months, we'll see a handful of examples that start to go through the process if all works out. So it's definitely not it's only one tool in the toolbox for dealing with the office market challenge, and in particular obsolete office supply. There's redevelopment is still going to be a significant part of that. Different types of redevelopment, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, probably need to be looked at in terms of how we can appropriately put those in the context of a review for shortened time and cost. But yeah, I would say, but maybe I've probably said it differently 10 different times, but probably about 10 to 12 or a dozen sort of makes sense. Now, I will say that if you asked me that 3 years ago and the conversation I had with developers, there was none, right? And part of that was the market is learning, and it's learning from success stories of folks that have done this successfully, and markets and particularly capital changes over time in terms of what it understands and how it understands how to make a return. And the lessons learned by early conversion projects are often used as models for doing it a little more efficiently the next time, and therefore saving some of that return. So all that being said, I think there's nothing that when someone says, well, that floor plate is too deep, that's until someone figures out how to use that floor plate differently. And so there may be more and more of that over time. I don't know, but I think often the markets will sort of continue to find innovations in a way to use these assets if they're available. And I think we are in a point of the cycle, unfortunately, or it's really structure, unfortunately, where the basis is low enough for these buildings where that is no longer a hurdle, where you can actually get some of these older office buildings for a pretty significantly low cost to at least consider adaptive reuse. So That's not a good thing for the tax base, but it's a good thing for the repurposing and for regeneration of the tax base over a long period of time.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. I think, hopefully I was able to post in the Q&A the direct link to the Commercial Market Resiliency Initiative webpage. Hopefully we were able to get that. And at this point, some comments in here, but I don't think we have any more questions. So for feedback, it's really important for us to receive some comments as well, but just around parking and affordable housing. But I don't see any additional questions at this point in time. And we are at 12:56. So if you have any final remarks, Mark, that you want to provide, that would be great.
No, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties up front, and thank you for everyone's time. And please reach out to Jill if you have any questions. You can do that in many ways, as Jill mentioned, the CMRI website, the portal, or just email us. We'll be in touch with some more details as we continue to work on it next month.